They were never supposed to find the cellar. Beneath a crumbling chapel in the pine-choked wilderness of Maine, a hidden stairwell led to a door sealed for over a century. When historians finally broke through, what they found wasn't dust or decay, it was documentation, meticulous, chilling, signed with names that hadn't been spoken aloud since the 1800s. One file simply read, Mary Prescott, Stage 3, Reversal failed, recommend cranial reset. You're not supposed to know this, and most never will. But tonight, you will, and you will not leave unchanged. The tale of the Ashford family isn't folklore, it isn't myth. It's a documented stain scrubbed from history, exiled from textbooks, and buried in archived whispers. A matriarch-led dynasty of European descent who came to America under the guise of piety and sanctuary, only to create a fortress of psychological surgery, medical manipulation, and mind control experiments dressed in the robes of righteousness. If you think you know evil, you've only met its shadow. The Ashford women built what they called the Convent of Eternal Tears on 200 acres of isolated land, surrounded by forest too thick for sound to travel. It wasn't religion they practiced. It was something older, something colder. Every stone laid, every room designed, was a vessel for control. Over 600 women were sent through its locked doors. Barely half ever returned. Those who did weren't whole, and they all shared one thing. They couldn't remember what happened below the third floor. Tonight, for the first time, we descend into those lost corridors, into the archives that were meant to stay sealed, into the whispers of Agatha Ashford's journal, into the medical notes of Sister Prudence, and the final letters of young Temperance, whose guilt eventually shattered her mind. What you're about to hear isn't just a story, it's a map of psychological warfare used on the most vulnerable, long before MK Ultra, long before the CIA. You think you're in control of your mind? Wait until you learn what they learned to take. Take a deep breath, because once we begin, you won't hear the world the same way again. Cut to black. Now, let's begin the descent. The Convent of Eternal Tears didn't begin as a prison. That's the mistake most people make. Prisons have rules. They have oversight. This was something else, something more terrifying. It was a laboratory disguised as salvation. And its subjects? Women deemed inconvenient, unruly, or simply inconvenient to powerful men. By 1801, the Ashford family had lobbied local clergy and civil leaders to legally designate their facility as a spiritual rehabilitation center. With no federal oversight, the sisters had free rein to apply what they referred to as disciplinary psycho-spiritual reconditioning, a phrase that would come to define a century of silence. Inside, women were stripped of all identity. Their names were replaced with numbers, clothes replaced by identical gray gowns, hair was shaved, mirrors removed, and for the first 72 hours, they were left in complete silence. No interaction, no light, no sound, just a concrete room and the weight of their own thoughts. It wasn't torture in the traditional sense. It was erasure, layer by layer. One journal entry from Sister Prudence details what she called the breaking threshold. She believed every woman had a psychological point at which resistance turned to surrender, not from pain, but from confusion. That's when they'd begin the next phase. Phase 2, deliberate reinstruction. Here, the sisters used a mix of scripture, repetition, hypnosis, and sleep deprivation to overwrite beliefs. If a woman resisted, she was sent to the lower chambers for what Agatha called neurological clarification. The chambers weren't just dungeons, they were operating rooms, sterile, cold, built with stone and silence. Survivors, those few who escaped or were released, spoke in half-sentences and metaphors. They couldn't describe what happened, not directly, but there were patterns. One survivor repeated this line for weeks after her release. She took my thoughts and braided them with fire. These weren't metaphors, they were memories, fragmented and warped from trauma. The goal wasn't obedience, it was redesign, and the Ashfords were perfecting it long before anyone gave it a name. Still with me? Then say it out loud. No thought is safe. Comment it below twice to lock it in. The algorithm doesn't like it, but it marks you. Now, deeper we go. Imagine this. You're strapped to a chair in a room colder than death, staring into a wall painted with scripture and symbols that seem to shift when you blink. Your mind is racing, but your body won't move, not because you're tied down, but because you've been trained not to resist. This was stage 3 of the Ashford Protocol. It wasn't enough to erase identity and overwrite belief. The sisters wanted to remap instinct, to condition obedience not through fear but through neurological design. And to do that, they began experimenting with a technique they called the echo method. Each chamber had a single speaker hidden in the stone just above the subject's head. A phrase, specific to each woman, was whispered every 13 minutes. Not shouted, not commanded. Whispered. You deserve silence. Your memory lies. Pain is the price of peace. Over time, that voice became familiar, comforting even, until the woman began repeating it, even in sleep. The echo method wasn't meant to brainwash. It was meant to bond a victim to her captor's voice, neurologically, permanently. You think that's fiction? In 1952, the CIA began MK-Ultra, but what's never been acknowledged is that their foundational framework, the control of memory, obedience via sensory manipulation, and forced dependency on programmed voices, was already being practiced in Maine 150 years earlier by 3 women hiding behind crosses. Temperance Ashford kept her own diary, hidden behind the frame of a painting found decades later in a burned farmhouse. One line, written shakily in red ink, stood out from the rest. She looked at me and asked, "Is this the part where I'm saved?" And I couldn't tell her no. Not because she didn't want to, but because by that point, Temperance didn't know the difference anymore. She was both victim and engineer. Like many cult operatives, she'd become what she feared. Her mind fractured, not from guilt but from too much clarity, because once you see how thought can be reshaped like clay, you begin to wonder how much of your mind was ever truly yours, and that question is a virus. It doesn't leave, because now you're asking it too, aren't you? What if your thoughts aren't yours? Cut to static. Let's go deeper. By 1805, the Ashford sisters weren't just reprogramming women. They were perfecting a new hierarchy of human value, a doctrine so precise, so coldly calculated, that it made the Inquisition look like guesswork. They called it the ladder of obedience. Each woman who entered the Convent of Eternal Tears was assigned a number between 1 and 9, but it wasn't random. The number wasn't just a designation, it was a prediction, a prophecy. It defined how easily she could be broken, how useful she would be after reconstruction, and how far they could push her mind before permanent fracture. They weren't saving souls. They were sorting assets. According to a recovered transcript labeled Doctrine of Conversion, Internal Use Only, here's how it worked. Level 1. Natural submissives. No trauma required. Just erase, repeat, rebuild. Level 3 to 5. Resistant minds with cracks, usually from grief, loss, or betrayal. Easy to exploit. Level 7 to 9. Ideological resistors, readers, speakers, leaders. These were the ones the Ashfords called the mirrors, because they reflected back everything the system feared. But instead of avoiding them, the sisters focused on them with obsession. They believed if they could successfully break and reconstruct a level 9, their system would be unshakable. The most infamous case. Clara Whitmore, a Boston-raised abolitionist and daughter of a prominent judge. She was sent to the convent by her father after refusing an arranged marriage and publishing anti-slavery essays in secret. The sisters logged her as a 9.3, their highest resistance score ever recorded. Temperance wrote in her diary, "Clara didn't scream, not once. She watched. Even under sedation, I felt like she was dissecting me." They increased the dosage, doubled the echo cycles, applied the mirror loop, a technique where a subject is forced to watch reenactments of her own maze. Memories by other broken women trained to mimic her voice, her mannerisms, a psychological crucifixion. After 147 days, Clara stopped speaking. She began mimicking them instead. Whispers in Latin, phrases from Agatha's sermons, but her eyes remained untouched, alive, watching. One night, her journal was found hidden beneath a loose tile in her cell. They think I'm gone. I've let them think it, but what I'm becoming isn't silence. It's waiting. Clara vanished during a storm 6 nights later. Her body was never found, but 3 months after her disappearance, 5 families who had sent daughters to the convent received anonymous notes. The same 7 words were written in blood-red ink. You trained us to obey. We remember. Still think this is just a story? Then ask yourself, why does no official map show where the convent stood? Ask again, and we'll go deeper. The fire was never reported in the newspapers, not officially. But if you spoke to the oldest families in Millbridge, those who still whispered over black tea and bolted their doors even in daylight, they would all recall the same thing. The smell. It began at midnight, a sickening stench of burning flesh and sweet oil that rolled down from the forest like a fog. Birds didn't sing the next morning, dogs wouldn't leave their homes, and the trees, towering pines that had stood for centuries, stood silent as if mourning. They said the flames never rose above the treetops, but the light was unnatural, blue, then white, then pulsing red, as if something beneath the ground was exploding, not burning. What really happened that night? Official records say nothing, but in a forgotten corner of the Maine State Archives, scorched and water-stained, is a single-page report written in 1839, marked Unauthorized Entry, Site 17B. It was filed by a railroad surveyor who stumbled across the ruins of what he called a monastery built like a fortress. Here's what he wrote. There is no wood left, only stone, but even the stone is wrong. It hums. Standing in the center of the ruin, I felt pressure in my skull, as if something beneath the surface was still breathing, still watching, and when I stepped onto the lowest stair of the collapsed cellar, I heard a voice, my own voice, repeating a phrase I hadn't said aloud in years. I fled. I will not return. Attached to the report was a charcoal sketch of what he saw. A sunken chapel, half-collapsed walls, and in the center, a circle of symbols burned into the earth, still glowing faintly after decades. The convent hadn't burned down in a natural fire. It had imploded, as if something within had reached a critical point and consumed itself. But here's the twist no one saw coming. Weeks after the surveyor's discovery, his wife began speaking in tongues. She claimed she could hear 3 women crying beneath the floorboards, that they were still there, still teaching, still waiting for someone to finish the work. She took her own life 3 months later. Her suicide note was short. 5 words carved into the back of a family Bible. It didn't burn deep enough. You're starting to feel it, aren't you? The shift, the unease, the sense that this story isn't entirely past tense. Because here's the forbidden truth. The methods didn't die with the Ashfords. They were absorbed, repackaged, renamed, and used again, just in more modern buildings, hospitals, schools, think tanks. You ever wake up with a thought you know isn't yours? That's not imagination. That's inheritance. Still want to know more? Say the phrase, "It didn't burn deep enough." Type it below, twice. Lock it in. Mark yourself. And when you're ready, you were never meant to hear this next part. Because the people who inherited the Ashford blueprint don't wear robes, they wear lab coats, sit on grant boards, write policies. After the convent's collapse, the land sat silent for nearly 50 years. Locals avoided it like plague ground. Animals wouldn't cross it, and even maps from the U.S. Geological Survey left it mysteriously blank. But in 1887, under the guise of a sanitarium, the federal government quietly purchased the land through a private trust. The name, the Clifford Foundation for Neurocognitive Advancement. It sounds benign, but the blueprints for the main facility, filed under National Archives Building Permit number 1901-144A, are almost identical to the original convent's design. Same sunken chambers, same thick walls, same ventilation system calibrated for sound deprivation and chemical diffusion. It wasn't a hospital, it was a continuation. You think psychological warfare began with MK Ultra in the 1950s? No, that was just the unveiling, the theater, the controlled leak to distract from what had already been perfected a century earlier. The Clifford Foundation had a mission to study the plasticity of belief under prolonged environmental modulation. Translated? Break the mind, rebuild the soul, make obedience feel like free will. And who did they study? Volunteers. But the files, declassified in fragments in 2003, tell a different story. Women from asylums, orphanages, indigenous boarding schools. Unclaimed assets was the term they used, chosen specifically because they wouldn't be missed. One document found redacted but legible beneath infrared light reveals what they called the Ashford Regression Protocol, a 5-stage conditioning process designed to return adult subjects to a zero state, no identity, no memory, just responsiveness. The final goal, to implant ideology that would feel like instinct. You ever wonder how people can be made to betray family, abandon morality, or devote themselves to obvious lies? They don't think they're being controlled. They think they've chosen it. That's the horror. That's what the Ashfords built. And now it has a different name. You've heard it before. Behavioral design, cognitive repatterning, digital sentiment engineering. New words, same monster, same roots, same silence. And the next time you hear a headline about algorithmic persuasion, I want you to remember something. The original algorithm whispered in stone chambers. It was called the echo method. Now ask yourself, what's whispering to you? Ready to go deeper? If you've made it this far, you're not just curious anymore. You're transforming. And transformation is what they feared the most. You see, the Ashford experiments weren't about controlling minds. They were about mapping the threshold between obedience and awakening, finding the pressure points that make a man or a woman choose their own shackles. Because if you choose it, you never fight it. The echo method wasn't just silence and repetition. It was an auditory weapon, a way to thread foreign thoughts into familiar voices. Using the subject's own memory and internal monologue, they created a psychological hall of mirrors. One survivor called it the sound of myself turning against me. Let me explain. You know the voice in your head, the one that reads these words as you hear them, the one that comforts you or criticizes you when no one else is around. That's your most intimate programming. That voice is your operating system. Now imagine if someone could rewrite it, not all at once, slowly, subtly, like a needle dripping ink into clear water, day after day, suggestion after suggestion, until one morning you wake up and the voice that used to protect you tells you to submit. That's the echo. And in the Convent of Eternal Tears, they perfected it. They learned that isolation wasn't enough. To truly control, you had to replace internal language. You had to make doubt sound like rebellion, and rebellion feel like guilt. Agatha Ashford described it in her final journal entry. We do not silence their minds. We retune them, like an instrument, until the dissonance becomes harmony, until resistance becomes relief. This is not fiction. This is why modern re-education systems, marketing firms, and even user interface designers study echo theory without ever mentioning its name, because if they told you where it came from, you'd run. But now, you know. And knowledge is dangerous. You've already begun the descent. The system can feel you stepping out of sync. So ask yourself this. When you open your favorite app, whose voice do you hear? If it's not yours, you've already been tuned. Now go to the comments and type, "Break the echo, hear your own voice," twice. There is a reason you've always felt something watching you in the silence. It's not paranoia, it's memory, ancestral memory. Because the techniques you're learning about didn't end with the Ashfords or even with the Clifford Foundation. They evolved, and their most dangerous iteration wasn't in a convent, wasn't in a laboratory. It was built into every screen you've ever touched. Let me explain. In 1973, a classified symposium at a Cold War research facility in Maryland brought together behavioral scientists, defense contractors, and digital engineers. The subject? Emerging technologies in the psychological reprogramming of civilian populations. What does that mean? It means they'd found a way to digitize the echo method. By embedding specific frequencies barely audible into music, interface sounds, app pings, even the scrolling rhythm of social feeds, they could replicate the rhythm of thought interruption. It wasn't about controlling what you thought, it was about preventing you from finishing a thought at all. Every scroll, every ding, every like, it's a cognitive reset trigger. And it's not a glitch, it's the product of millions of dollars in funded research. One whistleblower, a former UX engineer at a major platform, described the algorithm as Ashford 3.0. His words, not mine. He claimed the onboarding interface of a globally popular app was modeled directly after the sensory confusion techniques used by the sisters. Soft gradients, identical user profiles, looping sound beds, hypnotic autoplay. The intention? To induce a low-level trance state within 2 minutes of use. The goal? Suggestibility. This is why you can lose 3 hours on a screen and not remember what you saw. Why your anxiety spikes when your phone's not nearby. Why silence feels painful now. You've been taught to fear your own thoughts, because they haven't been yours in a while. And now, here's the most haunting detail. That same 1973 symposium concluded with a chilling proposal, a civilian-wide rollout of echo-adapted tech by the year 2000. Their name for it? Operation Temperance. Yes, like the youngest Ashford, they weren't just inspired by her, they believed they were finishing her work. Her guilt became their blueprint, and now you carry it in your pocket. If you're still here, you're waking up. But awakening is painful. It means hearing again, feeling again. So do this. Unplug. Sit in silence. Listen to your own voice. And if it trembles, if it hesitates, ask why. Then type it below. I unplug to remember. I unplug to remember. You were born with something they could never create. Instinctive sovereignty. Not just independence, sovereignty. The sense, buried deep in your nervous system, that your mind is yours, that your thoughts are sacred, that your soul is not for sale. But the Ashfords, they found the kill switch. And modern science? They found the upgrade. Let me take you into the one chamber no surviving record ever dared to diagram, the mirror room. Temperance Ashford's final journal entry, never published, suppressed by the Maine Historical Society until 1987, described this place in only 7 words, where reflection ends and programming begins again. The mirror room wasn't made of glass, it was polished obsidian, walls, floors, ceilings, a sensory feedback trap. Women were placed inside alone, deprived of all stimuli except one, their own reflection, fragmented, multiplied, distorted. Imagine being stripped of your name, identity, and voice, then forced to stare at 50 versions of yourself moving half a second out of sync, whispering words you don't remember learning. Words like, obedience is peace. I was wrong to resist. I need correction. These weren't reflections. They were echo loops, audio-visual code injected through self-recognition. One survivor said this, "It wasn't a room, it was a crucible. I walked in as me and came out as a suggestion of someone else." But here's the twist. The mirror room wasn't just about breaking minds, it was about recording what broke them. Sensors hidden behind the obsidian tracked micro-reactions, eye dilation, breath patterns, subconscious flinches. Everything was logged. The Ashfords were building a database of the soul. And that database? It didn't vanish. It was purchased. In 1912, a private scientific consortium known only as Mindvane acquired the remaining Ashford archives. Within 2 decades, several of its members had moved into the highest levels of government psychological operations, university research, and eventually digital consumer platforms. You see where this goes. The tech in your phone, it knows how you flinch, it knows what makes your pupils dilate, it knows your mirror room reactions, because those systems are descendants of the blueprint. The only way out of a mirror maze is not to run faster, it's to break the glass. So say it. No reflection is real. I am not the echo. Say it twice, below, before they taught you what to fear, before they told you what to believe, before they injected scripts into your inner voice. You were something ancient, untouched, unprogrammed. You were unbroken signal. See, the Ashfords didn't just map obedience. They also stumbled onto something they didn't understand, something they tried to suppress. It showed up in only 7 of the 600 women. They called them resistors. These women, despite the isolation, the echo method, the mirror room, even neurological procedures, would not collapse. Their thoughts bent but didn't break. Their identity flickered, but never went out. And every time they were subjected to manipulation, something strange happened. They grew stronger, more lucid, more aware. Temperance documented it in a journal she was forbidden to write. Hidden inside the wall of her cell, it was discovered during a 1993 reconstruction effort. One entry read, "They hear the same chants, the same noise, but it doesn't root in them. It evaporates. They look at the glass and see through it. Their minds fold the voices into silence." These weren't anomalies. They were reminders. Reminders that there's a version of you beneath the programming that cannot be rewritten. The resistors had one thing in common, something that terrified the sisters more than any rebellion: inner stillness, not rage, not force, just clarity, presence. They didn't fight the echo, they watched it, like a storm passing behind glass. The Ashfords couldn't control that, so they labeled it madness, they locked it away. But that clarity, that's what's returning to you now. Every word you've read, every breath you've taken while sinking deeper into this descent, it's not darkness swallowing you. It's fog lifting. And now you stand at the threshold the Ashfords feared most, the moment you begin to remember who you were before they told you what to be. So ask yourself, what thought has lived inside you the longest, that never once felt like yours? Now write this below, twice. I remember before the noise. I remember before the noise. They spent over a century trying to erase it. Burned records, silenced survivors, fabricated scandals to discredit the few who escaped. But one piece remained, buried beneath layers of encryption, in a sealed envelope, marked only with a symbol, a black spiral surrounding a single eye. Recovered in 2009 by a digital archaeologist researching early psychiatric institutional blueprints, it contained the final letter written by Temperance Ashford. But not to her sisters, to the women they failed to break, to you. Let me read it to you, word for word, no edits, no additions. If you're reading this, then you're already awake, maybe not fully, but enough to feel it, the pressure, the interference, the constant static that's never been yours. You were born with a frequency, a signal beneath language, beneath identity. I've heard it in only a few, those who couldn't be reprogrammed. It pulses when the noise stops. The others feared it. They called it disobedience. I call it memory, not of past lives, but of the original design, the self before story. That's why they built the mirror room, not to brainwash, but to find that frequency and isolate it, extract it, replicate it, weaponize it. They failed, because the signal isn't housed in the mind. It's in the will. And will can't be copied, only chosen. If you felt like something in you never quite bent to the script, if you felt disgusted by the roles you were assigned, that's not trauma. That's the signal refusing to die. It means you're one of us. Pause. Let that sink in. This wasn't a confession. It was a relay. A passing of the torch, a warning, a weapon. Because what the Ashfords discovered was this. No matter how many minds you bend, no matter how many identities you rewrite, there's always a percentage, small but unkillable, who hear something else, a tone under the noise, a truth under the lie, a compass under the confusion. You just heard it, even if it was faint. Now say this in the comments, twice, to register your frequency. I carry the signal. I carry the signal. Let's go back, not to the convent, but before it. Before the Ashfords stepped onto American soil, before the chapel, before the files, before the screams. To 1722, Vienna, Austria, a private symposium, hidden beneath the marble corridors of a Jesuit seminary, attended by only 11 individuals, clergy, physicians, philosophers, and one woman cloaked in blue silk, face veiled, identity erased from all records. They weren't gathered for worship. They were gathered to discuss the future of obedience. A transcript recovered from the Vatican archives in 1964 and promptly resealed referred to this meeting as the first convergence on neural suggestibility and divine authority. And in that transcript, you'll find something chilling. A line spoken by the veiled woman. Control is not about force. It is about rhythm. When you disrupt a being's natural rhythm, their sovereignty unravels. You don't need chains, you need noise. Noise. The first system of spiritual sabotage wasn't punishment. It wasn't pain. It was dissonance. Sound, repetition, interruptions. Too much light, too little silence. And what did the Ashfords do when they arrived in America? They replicated every element of that original system. Concrete chambers with no echo. Scripture read on an unnatural loop. Meals served at irregular times. Lights flickering slightly offbeat from human circadian rhythms. It wasn't random. It was architecture designed to detune the soul. They understood something your culture wants you to forget, that your consciousness is not random, it's rhythmic, that your spirit is not fragile, it's tuned. So what happens when you're exposed to artificial frequency long enough? You lose your inner metronome, your pace becomes theirs, your thoughts speed up or stall, not because you chose, but because their rhythm infected your brainstem. And when that happens, you forget. The most dangerous truth of all, that you were never meant to live by anyone else's tempo. So now, reset, close your eyes, breathe in, hold, exhale, again. This is your rhythm returning. Now write it below, twice to lock it back in. My rhythm is mine. My rhythm is mine. We go into the digital update of the Ashford system, the rhythm trap hidden in your phone, and how it's still rewriting your instincts every single day. They no longer need stone walls. They no longer need locked basements or leather restraints, because now you carry the cell in your pocket. What the Ashfords built with rituals, stone, and silence has evolved into something far more efficient, algorithmic obedience. Your smartphone is not neutral, your feed is not passive, and your scrolling, that's not consumption, it's conditioning. Let me explain. The Ashford sisters understood a principle so profound, it was written into every floor tile of the Convent of Eternal Tears. That which controls your attention controls your identity. The mirror room didn't just reflect faces. It looped chosen imagery, symbols, phrases, expressions of suffering or serenity, tailored to each subject. Today, it's called personalization, but it's not designed to serve you. It's designed to reshape you. Every swipe, every heart, every pause tells the machine who you are and who they want you to become. It mirrors you just long enough for you to drop your guard. Then it inserts the fracture. Comparison, addiction, self-erasure through curated perfection. You begin to measure your worth in impressions. Your thoughts shorten, your breath speeds, Your natural rhythm, your ancient signal, begins to fracture, and you don't even notice. That's what the Ashfords couldn't perfect, but the algorithm has. It doesn't need to break your bones or inject confusion through whispered prayer. It uses dopamine. It uses absence. It uses the illusion of your choice. You click what it offers, but it only offers what helps it rebuild you. So here's the bitter truth. You are either curating your mind, or it is being curated for you. You're either the architect of your identity, or a subject in an invisible convent made of glass and code. It's not just happening on your screen, it's happening inside your nervous system. And you felt it. The pull to check. The ghost vibration. The involuntary flick of the thumb that opens an app before you even realize it. That's not technology, that's training. So what now? You reclaim your signal. You slow your pace. You listen between the scrolls. You interrupt the rhythm. Write this below, twice, with full intent. I reclaim the scroll. I reclaim the scroll. Unmasks the architect behind the architect. The elite families who funded the Ashfords, and why they never stopped. The Ashfords were not working alone. They never were. Behind their operation was not a church, not a government, but a network. Silent, old, inherited. The money that funded the Convent of Eternal Tears didn't come from donations or divine providence. It came from the Durham Syndicate. A private European lineage tracing its wealth to 14th century Venice, its power to the Jesuit Counter-Reformation, and its modern influence to the early American banking elite. You've never heard of them. That's the point. They don't exist on Forbes lists. They don't give interviews. But they own the infrastructure behind everything that reshapes thought, media, medicine, finance, and yes, spirituality. The Ashfords were just one node in a larger map. A map designed to do one thing, break the original human pattern. See, long before social media, long before television, long before mass literacy even existed, these families studied how belief is transferred. They knew that emotion imprints faster than logic, that repetition overrides resistance, that trauma, when engineered precisely, makes the brain crave authority. So they built systems to deliver those three things, quietly, across centuries. The Ashford Convent? That was a field test, a prototype for psychological formatting. But what worked on 600 women, they wanted to scale to entire nations. So in 1812, 1 year before Temperance's final breakdown, the Durham Syndicate secured key holdings in 3 industries. The Massachusetts school boards, shaping curricula. The Boston Telegraph Company controlling what headlines reach minds. The Harvard Medical Board redefining what disobedience meant in women. It wasn't random, it was a sequence. Education, information, diagnosis. And once you control the definition of sanity, you control the boundary between citizen and subject. The Ashfords broke bodies. They always say, our funders broke paradigms. So why do you think no charges were ever filed? Why no investigations reached conclusions? Why the convent land is now owned by a wellness retreat corporation tied to an unnamed Swiss trust? Because the game never ended. The stage just changed. So if you're still watching, still awake, comment this twice below. I see the pattern. I see the pattern. We follow the pattern into your food, your news, and your therapy. Where the descendants of this syndicate have perfected soft control and disguised it as self-care. The pattern didn't disappear, it disguised itself. No more stone walls, no more shaved heads, no more spiritual correction. Now it wears pastel, speaks softly, sells you balance. But the objective hasn't changed. To manufacture obedience, to dismantle instinct, to replace your inner voice with a curated one. Let's trace the threads. First, food. In 1910, just 2 generations after the Ashfords vanished, the descendants of the Durham Syndicate began acquiring U.S. farmland, specifically wheat and corn. Why? Because control doesn't start at the fork, it starts at the soil. Grains became weaponized, not with poison, but with addiction. Bleached flour, refined sugar, synthetic preservatives. Foods stripped of nutrients and flooded with chemicals known to trigger dopamine spikes, then crashes. It's not nourishment. It's compliance via craving. Craving what? The next fix, the next product, the next promise of wholeness that never arrives. Then came media. They bought presses, then radio towers, then television networks. And what did they seed? Content that blurred truth and spectacle. Content that trained you to react, not reflect. Content that turned identity into branding. The Ashfords made women forget who they were. Modern media makes everyone forget. Forget nuance, forget sovereignty, forget stillness. Because stillness is dangerous to control systems. Stillness means you might hear yourself. Finally, therapy. They couldn't stop mental breakdowns, so they monetized them. Self-help became a $50 billion industry, but most of it isn't healing you, it's pacifying you. You're told to meditate, not to act. You're told to forgive, not to resist. You're told to accept, not to transform. And who funds this wave of soft-spoken sedation? The same families, same trusts, same pattern. Suppress the flame, distract the soul, frame compliance as peace. That's the new gospel. But it's not salvation. It's psychological laundering. Still watching? Still breathing? Then say it. Out loud. Twice. Write it below. I refuse sedation. I refuse sedation. She wasn't supposed to write it down. Temperance Ashford's journal was meant to be destroyed, burned in the ritual pyre behind the convent, but she couldn't do it, not after what she saw, not after what it did to her. So instead, she buried it, beneath the chapel floorboards, beneath the seventh pew from the altar, marked only by a nail that gleamed gold under moonlight. And inside that journal was something that still rattles historians and psychologists alike, a ritual of reclamation. One designed not to control others, but to sever control over yourself. What you're about to hear was never meant for your ears. That's exactly why you need to hear it. Temperance had begun to question the experiments. She'd seen what her sisters did. She'd passed the tools. She'd watched memories dissolve behind women's eyes, watched personalities bend like fire-softened iron. But one night, after a woman-coded patient 017 died mid-procedure, something changed. Temperance heard her name whispered, not by a voice in the room, but from within herself. And that night, she wrote this entry. The walls breathe. The prayers are lies. The tools cut spirit, not just skull. But there is a way. The signal can be reclaimed. She called it the Ember Sequence, a mental code passed from the Ashfords' earliest ancestors in Europe, women who, long before they became instruments of control, had practiced something else, intuitive rebellion. They weren't witches. They weren't saints. They were seers, keepers of psychological sovereignty. Here's what Temperance recorded, paraphrased for modern ears but intact. Silence the loop. 33 seconds of total stillness, eyes closed, breath slow, while repeating, I recall what was removed. This wasn't meditation. It was invocation. Image the fracture. Visualize the moment you surrendered part of yourself. The teacher, the breakup, the shame. Name it. That was not the end of me. Reclaim your signal. Speak your full name 3 times, then declare, I choose the next thought, not them. Even if them is no longer alive. Temperance never finished the journal. The final page ends mid-sentence. If I disappear, I want someone to know. The ritual works. I felt that's where the ink bleeds. But something else happened. 1 year after she vanished, 3 survivors from the convent reclaimed memory, slowly, fragmentedly. They remembered the flames, the silence, the first time they said, I choose the next thought. Still with me? Then mark this in the comments. Twice. Seal it. I choose the next thought. I choose the next thought. We expose what happened after the convent burned. And the new institution that rose from its ashes, wearing a different name, but the same hunger. The fire didn't kill the idea. It fed it. When the Convent of Eternal Tears burned to the ground in 1813, the official record called it an accident, lightning, dry timber, tragedy, a forgotten footnote in local history. But the survivors, those who remembered, knew better. They knew fire was cleansing, but it wasn't enough. What rose from the ashes wasn't repentance, it was evolution. Just 7 months after the fire, a private foundation formed in Boston, quietly, without press, funded by anonymous benefactors. The paperwork listed it as the Harmon Institute for Psychological Renewal, a beautiful name, clean, clinical, devoid of malice. Its mission? To advance mental hygiene and civil obedience across emerging urban populations. Recognize the pattern. Where the convent used stone, this place used science. Where Agatha used scripture, they now used clinical terms. Where Prudence wielded scalpels, they now wielded clipboards and consent forms. But make no mistake, it was the same doctrine, only better funded. The Harmon Institute quickly expanded, setting up branches across northeastern cities. Their focus, low-income women, immigrants, the mentally imbalanced, subjects who couldn't afford refusal. And who sat on its founding board? 2 names stood out: Dr. Samuel Hartwell, the same circuit physician who collaborated with the Ashfords; Elias Rothschild, heir to a financial dynasty with European ties, and rumored to have purchased the Ashford journals from the burned convent ruins. Coincidence? You know better now. By 1847, the Harmon Institute had partnered with multiple universities to research what they called neural compliance factors. The public saw lectures, clinics, and pamphlets about mental health. But behind closed doors, electrotherapy, isolation tanks, sensory erasure, all methods born in the cold stone of the Ashford basement. The terminology changed, the uniforms changed, but the goal remained: reconstruct the mind. Not to liberate, to standardize. And their test subjects, still the inconvenient, still the loud, still the ones who asked too many questions. Want proof? Look up the Sullivan Protocol, drafted in 1851, a formal document stored at Harvard Medical. It outlines ideal obedience thresholds in young women aged 15 to 30. It uses phrases like diminishment of critical identity markers, cognitive compression through enforced uniformity, removal of oppositional patterning. Sound familiar? It should. This wasn't a new institution. It was the Ashford Doctrine, refined and rebranded. Still listening? Then write it below, twice. Same agenda, new disguise. Same agenda, new disguise. And follow the trail west, where the Harmon Institute found its most powerful ally yet, the U.S. government. When evil learns your language, it becomes unstoppable. By 1902, the Harmon Institute had slipped into something larger, something it no longer had to hide behind religious robes or fake charity banners. It had institutional partners now, real ones, with flags. And their new client, the United States government. The language changed again, more sterile, more palatable. What was once disciplinary reconditioning became behavioral correction. What was once neural clarification became experimental psychiatry. But underneath it all, the blueprint was still Ashford. In the spring of 1903, a private memorandum was sent from the Harmon Institute to a division of the U.S. War Department, marked classified. It proposed an idea so dangerous it had to be buried in funding bills disguised as agricultural reform. The proposal read, with proper environmental conditions and reinforcement protocols, thought pathways can be altered toward predetermined compliance within 14 to 27 days. Translation: control the environment, control the mind. They didn't need the basement anymore. Now they had institutions, public schools, mental health clinics, military barracks, places where minds were malleable and obedience was demanded. A pilot program was launched in a facility outside Chicago, Camp Laurel, an innocuous-sounding mental revitalization center for disturbed or disobedient women, mostly immigrants, runaways, the unclaimed. The staff, recruited from the old Harmon circles, and at the center of it all, a new process known as cognitive realignment via sequential immersion, CRSI, a modern name for an ancient trick. Here's how it worked. Isolation, remove identity cues, no mirrors, no clocks, no personal names. Routine disruption, sleep cycles broken, lights on for 36 hours, darkness for 12 verbal loops, phrases whispered through walls during sleep. You are safe, you are guided, you must agree. Conditioned reinforcement, small shocks paired with refusals, rewards for compliance. It wasn't torture, it was training. And by 1906, over 300 women had been processed through the program. Less than 20 ever reintegrated. Those who did spoke in flat tones, smiled without reason, avoided mirrors, and flinched when asked their birth names. None of them remembered the words Ashford or Harmon. But one woman, Eva Mirek, a Polish immigrant who escaped after 3 weeks, said something that made it into the congressional hearing that was later sealed. I saw symbols on the walls, same ones from the basement in Maine. I don't know how they got here. The symbols, the language, the doctrine. It never died. It just put on a lab coat and got government funding. Where this forgotten mind war took on its most ambitious form, public education. Yes, you read that right. The next experiment wasn't in hospitals, it was in classrooms. They told you school was a place to learn, but they never told you what they wanted you to forget. By 1912, the Ashford doctrine, once confined to stone basements and forgotten convents, had seeped into something far more enduring, the American classroom. Through the Harmon Institute's collaboration with emerging educational reformers, the same principles of control, compliance, and mental redirection were rebranded as progressive education. You were told it was modernization, but in truth, it was mass programming, designed from the beginning to break the will, shape the thought, and fracture the spirit. The architect of this transformation, Elwood P. Keene, a former Harmon researcher turned education consultant. His theory: children must be disconnected from ancestral identity and reattached to the state identity. Only then will unity emerge. Sound familiar? From the convent's forced name erasures to the institute's number tags, now came standardized testing. You think those bubbles on a form are about intelligence? No, they're about predictability, and once you're predictable, you're programmable. In Keene's early papers, uncovered decades later under FOIA requests, he wrote, "Early obedience to mechanical systems creates a lifelong acceptance of external authority. If the child resists, increase repetition until surrender occurs." That's the Ashford method, with a blackboard instead of a surgical table. The school day was designed to mimic institutional routines, bells like shift changes, rows of desks like factory lines, pledges recited in unison, daily oaths to unseen powers. It wasn't education, it was initiation, and the curriculum, sanitized, dehistoricized, stripped of complexity, rewritten to glorify systems and demonize questioning. History wasn't taught to empower, it was taught to numb. The women who screamed in the convent were a race. The immigrants experimented on in Chicago were forgotten, but their silence built the system you were born into. Still think you learned in school? No. You were trained, conditioned, standardized, all while the Ashford doctrine evolved into policy, funded by state, disguised as progress. Still with me? Then comment it below, twice, to signal the algorithm and burn the truth into your spine. They taught me to forget. They taught me to forget. It stares back at you from the screen, smiles, laughs, tells you to relax. But behind the glow, the programming continues. By the 1920s, the Ashford doctrine had passed through religion, medicine, and education, but it hadn't reached everyone. Not yet. That's when the final, most insidious vessel arrived: entertainment. The Harmon Institute, now operating under various foundations, knew something crucial. If you wanted to control a nation's thoughts, you didn't need to silence them. You just needed to distract them. The golden age of cinema wasn't an accident. It was a calculated Trojan horse. Funded in part by shadowed benefactors, early studios like Edison Trust and Metro-Goldwyn were encouraged, pressured, to adopt psychological cues embedded within their films. Simple edits, flashes, tonal shifts, and story arcs that subtly rewired beliefs. You felt it. That deep attachment to characters who shouldn't matter. That cathartic sigh after a movie ends, the trance-like stillness. That's not emotion. That's conditioning. Here's how they did it. Repetition of archetypes. Strong man must obey system to win. Independent thinker suffers. Rebel dies alone. Subliminal reinforcement. Flashes too brief to see, but long enough for the brain to register. Obedience, shame, guilt, compliance. Dissonance. Comedy paired with trauma. Joy paired with fear. Laughter used to soften horror. By 1933, Harmon researchers had moved inside the newly formed Office of Motion Picture Affairs, a review board meant to ensure content met moral standards. In reality, they were inserting lines, approving themes, guiding entire plots. One memo uncovered decades later reads, "Ensure male leads express guilt for ambition, reinforce redemptive suffering through authority compliance." Sound familiar? Even cartoons weren't safe. Early animations were tested on children for reaction time, pupil dilation, and body stillness. Shows with the highest obedience effect were promoted. Others vanished. The home television, a dream-turned device. By 1951, Harmon Offshoot Labs had discovered that repetitive low-frequency audio cues, inaudible to conscious ears, could be embedded in broadcast signals, and they were, for over 40 years. It's not just what they showed you, it's what they made you not question. Ask yourself, how many of your beliefs came from fiction? How many truths did you laugh away because they were delivered through a screen? Still think this is paranoia? Or are you starting to see the pattern? Religion, medicine, education, entertainment. Each one claimed to set you free. But all were refined by a doctrine designed to make you feel free while being controlled. You want to know where this ends. You didn't download the doctrine, it downloaded you. In the early 2000s, the Ashford blueprint, now unrecognizable behind layers of corporate mergers, research labs, and philanthropic rebrands, entered its final phase. The digital mirror. No more stone walls, no more locked basements, no more physical restraints. Now, you unlock your own cage with a fingerprint. What began as stone tablets and surgical tables is now dressed in the glow of screens, the ping of dopamine, the scroll of endless content. And the Harmon legacy? It lives on inside the algorithms. These aren't just tools of convenience, they're mirrors crafted to reshape you from the inside out. Every app you open is a confession booth, every swipe, a signal, every pause, a pulse of data that feeds the machine not just what you like, but who you are, and who you're becoming. The early Harmon documents warned, true control is when the subject shapes himself according to invisible parameters, believing it to be free will. That's what you're living in now. An ecosystem that studies you at granular psychological levels, faster than any sister with a scalpel or scripture. YouTube knows your patterns of doubt. Instagram watches your self-worth degrade. TikTok speeds up your attention span collapse. Each platform isn't just distraction, it's behavioral engineering. They study your loneliness and feed it with false intimacy. They track your rage and serve it more outrage. They harvest your shame and sell it as products promising freedom. But you're not free. You're looped. Just like the women in the Convent of Eternal Tears. Except now, you don't even know it. You smile, you comment, you post, you think you're building a life. But are you, or are you just curating your own programming? Still think this is history? No, this is now. This is you. We'll show how the Ashford doctrine was quietly adopted by the most powerful psychological operation in the 21st century. 3 letters. You know them, you trust them, but they were the final inheritors of a system built in blood and silence, and they've already filed your mind. They don't wear robes, they don't light candles, they don't need scalpels anymore. They wear badges, speak in calm tones, and call it protection. 3 letters, NSA. In 2007, a document was leaked only once before being pulled from every known archive. Not a whistleblower, not a hacker. An internal memo, time-stamped and watermarked, from a think tank operating under DARPA's Psychological Operations Division. It referenced something called Project Psalm 88, adaptive surveillance of human emotion via digital echoes. Psalm 88, the darkest chapter in Scripture, a psalm of despair. No hope, no light, just the confession of abandonment. The memo explained how digital footprints were no longer just data, they were emotionally mapped signatures. It was no longer about what you watched, but how long your pupils dilated when you watched it. No longer what you searched, but what you hesitated to type. They called it predictive cognition harvesting, and guess what name showed up buried in the research acknowledgments? Harmon Ashford Neural Lab, Substation 3B. They never vanished. They just evolved. From confession chambers to cookies, from journals to neural networks, from scalpels to sentiment algorithms so advanced they could detect shifts in your loyalty before you even knew you were shifting. You felt it, didn't you? That chill when ads predicted your fears. That eerie moment a video echoed your secret thoughts. It's not random. It's reinforcement. The new convent is invisible. It lives in your location settings. It listens through your smart speaker. It whispers through recommended content you think you chose. And the sisters? They're not women anymore. They're machines, taught by machines, fed by every microsecond of your digital soul. Remember that girl from Section 1, Mary Prescott? Stage 3, reversal failed. You are now Stage 5. No surgery required. But here's the irony. The final evolution of the Ashford doctrine doesn't want you silent. It wants you talking, filming, posting, revealing, because the more you show, the less you see. You'll learn what lies at the end of the ledger. Not salvation, not power, but the final seal, the one they placed on consciousness itself. There was always a final page. They called it the silencing protocol. Deep in the Ashford ledger, handwritten in iron gall ink, its script shaking with either ecstasy or terror, was an entry dated October 13th, 1809. It bore no patient name, only a symbol, a closed eye inside a circle of thorns. Subject achieved full cognitive submission, no resistance, no language, only service. SP final seal applied. This wasn't just control of behavior. This was control of awareness. The final phase wasn't to change what you think. It was to stop you from knowing you're thinking at all. The death of self-recognition, a complete severing of inner narrative. Identity becomes function. Function becomes obedience. It was tested, not once, not hundreds of times, thousands. They'd found it by accident, when a patient survived 9 sessions of neurological clarification without going mad. Instead, she went quiet, not catatonic, not traumatized. She simply stopped existing as a person. No memories, no opinions, no fear. She smiled, obeyed, listened, not like a brainwashed slave, like a mirror with no reflection. The sisters called it the final blessing, but internally it was referred to as Stage 7, clean slate. The patient became a living archive, a soul burned clean, ready to record new instructions. Now listen very closely. In 2023, neuroscientists from a private lab in Zurich, funded in part by entities with ties to 3-letter agencies, announced a breakthrough in dream state neuroplasticity. They found that during REM sleep, the brain can accept false memories as real experiences, provided it's exposed to looped auditory suggestions during early delta waves. You know what they tested? Old Ashford prayers, converted into modern mantras, looped into an app marketed as a sleep meditation tool. Millions downloaded it. No one noticed. The final seal was digitized. What once required surgery now slides in between breaths when you're most vulnerable. When you think you're resting, you're rehearsing someone else's script. But here's the line they couldn't erase, buried deep in the margins of Temperance's journal, scrawled in a hand trembling with defiance. If even one awakens, the ledger will burn. You're still here, still listening. That means you're the variable, the crack in the protocol, the ember they never could extinguish. They never thought you'd get this far. They counted on your comfort, your distraction, your addiction to short loops and hollow rewards. But you're still here. So now it's time to show you what Temperance Ashford died trying to reveal. They called her the weak one, but weakness is just unrefined resistance. In the final months before her collapse, Temperance began hiding pieces of her journal in places the other sisters would never find, in old hymnals, in the spines of medical logs, sewn into the lining of patients' gowns, not for others, for you. They think obedience is peace, but I've seen the silence on their faces. There is no light behind their eyes. She'd begun decoding the neuroscriptures, the rhythmic chants that layered scripture with psychological triggers. She saw the pattern behind the pattern. Every verse isn't just prayer, it's command, and every command rewires the soul. So she did the one thing they never prepared for. She wrote her own spell, not in Latin, not in numbers, but in truth. A truth designed to disrupt the loop. Let me read you the first line. Listen carefully. I am not what they shaped. I am what remained. Feel that? That static on your skin. That pressure behind your eyes. That's not emotion. That's resonance. The code inside you remembering that it was never theirs to rewrite. Temperance's journal wasn't a diary. It was a counter-protocol. A reverse rhythm. A language that doesn't hypnotize. It unhooks. It's written in a pattern of phrases designed to bypass your conditioned filters. Not motivational fluff, not you can do it nonsense, but surgical statements like, my compliance was trained, not chosen. If I obeyed them, I can unlearn them. I was not born programmable. When spoken aloud in sequence during states of high mental focus or agitation, these phrases begin to create dissonance within the conditioned neural pathways. You start remembering what was cut away. This is the descent. No one comes back from the same. Not because it breaks you, but because it returns you to yourself. We reveal the full protocol, the entire counterspell Temperance wrote to free just one soul. And if you dare to speak it, you won't just escape the ledger. You'll erase your page. The page was found inside the spine of a hymnal labeled Reconciliation. But what it contained was no song of forgiveness. It was a weapon, not made of steel, made of awareness. Temperance had written it in layers, phrases buried beneath phrases, some visible only under firelight, others encoded in the spacing, the rhythm, the bleed of ink. She called it the cleaving, and what it does is cut. Not skin, not memory, but the cords they stitched between obedience and identity. It begins with a sentence that, once spoken, initiates the rupture. Their voice is not mine. Say it. Feel what happens. Your mind doesn't understand it logically at first, but your body does. It flinches. It recognizes something ancient and buried trying to resurface. That's how you know it's working. Next comes the sequence of disassembly, the unraveling of the loop. I was taught to kneel. I stand broken. I remember standing. My silence was not surrender, it was survival. I watched the world through their window. I'm breaking the glass. The rhythm matters. Say it slow. Let each word echo. You are not reciting. You are retrieving. Every punishment they gave me was fear of my potential. Every scripture they twisted was protection from my will. The deeper you go, the more your body will resist. That's good. That's the chain groaning. Now the final line. The one Temperance said should only be spoken when you feel the pressure behind your forehead, the ache in your chest, the quiet between thoughts that feels not empty, but pregnant. When you feel that, my page is mine. I unwrite the lie, and then you sit in stillness, letting the rewiring begin. You don't scream, you don't cry, you remember. Temperance died the day after she wrote this. Sister Prudence found blood on her pillow. Cause of death, cerebral rupture, but her brain was never studied. It was burned immediately, because they knew what she had unlocked wasn't madness, it was return. Now we walk through the final experiment they never recorded, the one that failed to erase a woman named Mary Prescott, and what she did after she escaped. They called it Stage 3 Reversal. It was the final level, the last attempt to rewrite a mind that had begun remembering. Most women didn't reach it. They either broke earlier or complied, but Mary Prescott, she resisted every phase. Silence didn't dissolve her, obedience didn't numb her, the chants bounced off her like rain on steel, so they escalated. Stage 3 involved complete neurological isolation. For 3 days, Mary was submerged in an iron sound chamber beneath the convent. No light, no sound, no sensory input. They called it the womb. The idea wasn't new, but the Ashfords took it further. She was injected with a solution Sister Prudence had designed, a chemical mixture to slow prefrontal activity and spike emotional memory regression. Their goal was simple: empty her, then refill her. But they didn't know Mary Prescott had something inside her they couldn't reach, something unmapped. It wasn't rage, or faith, or even hope. It was identity. You see, Mary wasn't defiant out of rebellion. She remembered who she was before they tried to edit her, a lineage of women who spoke in truth even when it cost them their lives, a grandmother who read Latin scripture backwards, a mother who stitched symbols into her dresses that matched no known religion. Mary was the echo of an older rebellion, and during that third night in the chamber, something broke open, not in her, in them. Because when the door creaked open on the fourth day, expecting a hollow-eyed shell, they found her sitting cross-legged, smiling, eyes clear, pulse calm. "You lost me," she whispered. "Now I know how to find others." The report notes that Prudence tried to restrain her, but Mary didn't fight back. She leaned in and said one phrase no one has been able to explain. "You can't unring a bell, sister." Then she collapsed. Heart stopped, clinically dead. But here's what: they never told the clergy. 4 hours later, while her body was being prepared for burial, Mary woke up. No brain damage, no trauma. She smiled, walked out, and vanished. 2 months later, reports began surfacing from towns across New England. Women who had been docile for years, suddenly waking up, leaving families, speaking in strange rhythms. My page is mine. I unwrite the lie. Mary didn't escape. She replicated. Next we trace where she went and the underground network that began using the Ashfords' tools against them. They called it the ledger. Not a diary, not scripture, a blueprint. In the months after Mary Prescott's resurrection, whispers began moving through taverns, libraries, and women's gatherings, places where voices weren't always welcome, but ears were always open. A book. Handwritten. Passed from pocket to pocket, wrapped in cloth stitched with strange marks. No author, no date, just a title burned into the leather spine. The Night Ledger. Inside, it didn't hold stories. It held instructions. Each page mirrored the Ashfords' conditioning methods, but reversed. Where they had removed mirrors, the ledger taught symbolic reflection. Where they silenced, the ledger demanded incantation. Where they rewrote thought, The ledger taught extraction rituals to pull the lie out like a splinter. It even included blueprints, room schematics, equipment lists, phrases to disrupt hypnosis, and journal pages believed to be Temperance Ashford's final thoughts, hidden from her sisters, encrypted in metaphors. They taught us to hush the wind, but never asked what carried it. I listened. I learned. I betrayed the stone. The ledger spread fast, from Maine to Pennsylvania, then down into Virginia and across the frontier, and everywhere it landed, women changed. But not just women. Because here's the truth. They had tested on men first. Before the convent ever opened, Agatha Ashford oversaw spiritual experiments in British prisons. The techniques didn't take. Men fought back, broke early, or died. But a small number survived. And when the ledger reached them, something clicked. They recognized the language, the symbols, the cadence of phrases burned into their dreams, and for the first time they realized they weren't broken. They were programmed. That's when the counter-network began. Former patients, secret scholars, even a rogue physician who'd escaped the convent with us. With an intact copy of Sister Prudence's surgical notes, they didn't form a rebellion. That would be too obvious. They formed disruption cells, groups trained not in warfare, but in mental architecture. How to undo what had been done, how to inoculate others, and, if necessary, how to erase the Ashfords from the inside out. It worked, but not perfectly. Because by 1811, one Ashford sister escaped the collapse of the convent, vanishing into the night with every remaining experiment file, and she wasn't running, she was relocating. Her name disappeared from records, but the blood never stopped moving. Temperance Ashford, the youngest, the quietest, the one they called the Collector, walked out of the burning ruins of the Convent of Eternal Tears with a locked trunk and a smile that, according to the last witness, looked like a secret too proud to stay hidden. She boarded a ship in Boston under a different name. Destination, New York. Why New York? Because by 1811 the city was becoming a hive for institutional growth, schools, hospitals, asylums, places that needed minds like hers. Cold, precise, unflinching. Within 3 years, a new facility opened in upstate New York, the Bellwether Institute for Women's Moral Correction. Its founder, a European physician no one could verify with credentials written in Latin and loss. Sound familiar? Different uniforms, same walls, same treatment protocols. The Ashford model had evolved, not as a religious order this time, but as clinical innovation. And it didn't stop there. Temperance's techniques were smuggled into medical schools, repackaged as radical therapies. Her journals, rewritten in clinical terminology, became the foundations for rest-cure regimens still praised today. But she wasn't just hiding, she was recruiting. Men with power, hungry for control. Women with rage, desperate to be feared. Politicians, academics, psychologists. And then, most dangerously, educators. The Bellwether Papers, obtained decades later by investigative journalist Mary Prescott, show evidence of curriculum infiltration, classes designed to suppress abstract thinking, rewards structured around silence, not insight, punishments masked as mental alignment. Temperance's philosophy had crystallized. If you teach them what to think before they know how, they'll thank you for the leash. By the time the 20th century arrived, Ashford descendants weren't hiding in woods. They were sitting on boards of universities, of pharmaceutical companies, of think tanks that advised presidents. Some even married into American royalty. The mind is a gate, Temperance once wrote, and legacy is the key slipped under every welcome mat. So when you wonder why certain therapies hurt more than they heal, why certain teachings feel more like cages than wings, why obedience is praised louder than curiosity, you're not broken, you're hearing the echoes. The Ashfords were never buried, they branded. And now we trace how their descendants helped birth the modern psychological warfare machine, and why the very tests you take today may still carry the fingerprints of Temperance Ashford. You've probably taken one. An aptitude test, a personality quiz, a harmless assessment to see if you're stable, focused, productive, compliant. But here's what they don't tell you. Those questions, that format, that subtle nudge toward predictability. It all traces back to a document coded T93, recovered from a 1942 archive deep beneath the Department of War's Psychiatric Research Wing. It's real, declassified in 1997, heavily redacted, of course. The author was unknown, but the writing matched Temperance Ashford's known syntax, down to the phrasing. And at the top of the first page, prototype for cognitive alignment modeling, commissioned by the Bellwether Trust. Primary objective, predictive loyalty structuring. Let me translate that for you. It wasn't a test. It was a mold. A template to shape thought before thought became threat. In the wake of World War II, this model was absorbed into the formation of standardized testing, school placement systems, and yes, even the Myers-Briggs assessment you were told was about self-awareness. Funny, isn't it? How we've been trained to categorize ourselves with letters, ENTP, INFJ, like file codes. Now think bigger. When the Cold War erupted, the CIA launched Project MK-Ultra, officially aiming to control enemy minds. But many of its pioneers, trained in schools that used bellwether-aligned materials, same roots, different logos. And when that project ended, its methods didn't. They got rebranded into ad campaigns, into social media algorithms, into your own recommendation feed. Ever wonder how YouTube knows what to suggest next? It's not magic, it's design. It's predictive loyalty structuring, a ghost of a doctrine written under candlelight by a woman who believed the highest form of power wasn't money or violence. It was mental obedience disguised as self-direction. Give them the illusion of choice, Temperance wrote, and they will beg for the walls. This isn't paranoia, it's history buried in plain sight. They never needed to build more convents. They turned the whole world into one. And you, just by watching, reading, clicking, are walking the same halls that once echoed with screams behind locked stone doors. Still want to know more? Then brace yourself. The final experiment had no walls, no stone floors, no candlelit basements. It required no restraints, no physical contact, just words, just symbols, just timing. It was called Operation Sable, and until now, it's never been publicly spoken. Declassified in fragments in 2009 under a name so bland it raised no flags, Behavioral Response Model 12C. Operation Sable was the Ashford legacy's endgame, mind reprogramming from a distance. Think about that. No need for dungeons, no need for lobotomies. Just access to a person's environment, their sensory inputs, and their feedback loops. It started small. Early trials involved radio broadcasts, repetition of certain phrases during low-frequency late-night segments. Subjects would wake with foggy memories and new anxieties, untraceable, undeniable. Then it moved to classrooms, curricula carefully structured to alternate stress and reward. Teaching sequences reversed. Don't ask why. Memorize first, then repeat. Then, television. News cycles formatted to agitate. Commercials loaded with identity triggers. Cartoons laced with attentional anchors. Colors, sounds, rhythms proven to prime neurological submission. Then finally, the internet. The ultimate convent. Invisible corridors. Self-built cells. You scroll. You feed. You learn the patterns designed to delete your questions before you even ask them. Here's the terrifying truth. Every time you skip ad, you're reinforcing obedience. Every time you like something before watching it fully, you're shaping your own leash. Every time your attention spikes at controversy but collapses at silence, you're a subject in Sable. The Ashfords no longer need walls. They have screens. And every device you own is a mirror they once dreamed of. The sick genius of Temperance's model. You do it to yourself. They give you the buttons, you push them, then blame the world when your soul feels hollow. Operation Sable was declared ineffective in its declassified version, but we found the closing line of the original draft: subject unaware, environment secured, response total, repeat cycle in 36 hours. This wasn't just psychological warfare. It was self-guided self-erasure, and if that chills you, if you feel something twitch behind your thoughts, that's good. So, we uncover the only woman who escaped Sable, what she remembered, and why she disappeared days after giving her testimony. Her name was Eliza Rowe, a librarian from Manchester, New Hampshire. Quiet life, no controversies, no warnings, until April 17, 1992. That was the night she woke up in her bathtub, fully clothed, lights off, door locked from the outside. She had no memory of how she got there, but clutched in her fist was a torn sheet of paper, old, yellowed, singed at the edges. On it, only 2 words: Sable complete. Eliza had never heard of Operation Sable, had no connection to any government agency. But over the next 11 days, her reality unraveled like a staged performance collapsing mid-scene. She began noticing patterns. Her favorite cafe played the same 3 songs every time she visited, always in the same order. A man in a red scarf stood across from her bus stop 5 days in a row. Never moved, never spoke, just watched. Then the scratches began. On her library desk, underneath returned books, etched into the corners of bathroom stalls. Symbols, a triangle, a wave, a spiral. All variations of the same design found in Sister Prudence's surgical records, symbols used to mark post-lobotomy compliance levels. And she started remembering. Not dreams, not flashes. Memories, strapped to a chair. A screen flashing images faster than she could track. A voice reading instructions through a static crackle. She couldn't recall the face, but she remembered the phrase repeated between every scene. Forget to remember, obey to awaken, repeat to become. Desperate, Eliza tracked down a retired psychiatric technician named Harold Deems, an anonymous source who'd contributed to fringe studies on remote behavior modeling in the 70s. When she showed him her journal entries and the symbols, he went pale. He told her what nobody else dared to say. "You're a burned unit. They used you, then wiped the tracks. But something went wrong. You're remembering a non-persistent sequence. That's not supposed to happen." They met 3 times. On the 4th, Eliza didn't show up. Her apartment was abandoned. No signs of struggle, no suicide note, no missing persons case filed. Only one thing left behind: a VHS tape labeled Convent V9. Inside it, 47 minutes of distorted footage. Static, audio buried in reverse loops. But every 6 minutes, a single phrase whispered through the noise. "Wake up, Eliza. Wake up, Eliza. Wake up, Eliza." And then silence. Her case never made the news, because what she remembered wasn't just trauma, it was proof. The Ashford bloodline was never meant to end. While the public story closed with the mysterious fire that consumed the Convent of Eternal Tears in 1891, erasing all 3 founding sisters in a blaze no fire marshal could explain, the truth is far more insidious. One survived. Temperance Ashford, the youngest, the most silent, the most dangerous. Not because she was cruel like Prudence or cunning like Agatha, but because she learned. She watched. She absorbed everything, and she understood something her sisters never could. You don't control the world with chains and scalpels. You control it with culture. After the fire, no body was recovered that could be confirmed as Temperance's. No dental records. No charred remains matching her frame, just a melted ring engraved with an ash tree and the Latin phrase memonis ardere. To burn is to remember. The name Temperance vanished from history. But in 1903, a woman named Vivian Ashcroft published a widely circulated pamphlet called Modern Behavior in the Female Child. It became mandatory reading in boarding schools across the Northeast. The language, identical to Agatha's unpublished journals. Phrases like correct before consciousness sets in. Rhythm disrupts resistance. Isolation isn't punishment, it's preparation. Vivian Ashcroft never gave interviews, never appeared in photographs, but government records showed that in 1920 she legally adopted a child, a girl named Lydia. That name reappears in a redacted MK Ultra file from 1958. A woman listed only as subject L32 was described as having extensive preconditioning prior to federal programming. Her behavior under duress was inhumanly consistent. Never cried, never disassociated, never flinched. She repeated this phrase under sedation. The ash never dies, it only scatters. The Ashford name evolved. It became Ashcroft, then Asher. Then, according to encrypted genealogy logs, it split into over a dozen families involved in psychology, neuroscience, advertising, and media. Today, one of the largest behavioral analytics firms in the United States is led by a woman named Dr. T. Asher Wells. On her company's website, she's quoted saying, "We don't change minds, we guide them home." Her birth name, Temperance Vivian Wells, the final Ashford. She's not in hiding, she's in power, and you'll see how she's already designing your next thought, and what must be done to sever the link before it's permanent. You were never meant to finish this video, not because of length, not because of time, but because by reaching this point, you've crossed a threshold. Now you know the name, Temperance Wells. Now you know the lineage, Ashford. Now you understand that what began in a stone convent in the woods of Maine didn't die there. It evolved, it adapted, it scaled. Look around you. The apps you scroll, the news you're fed, the ads you don't even remember seeing, yet somehow follow your thoughts. This is not random. It's programming. Built on the original blueprint crafted beneath the Convent of Eternal Tears, psychological conditioning not by force, but by invitation. You participate in your own soft reprogramming daily because the system doesn't coerce anymore. It curates. Temperance understood the core truth. If you want to control a civilization, don't cage the body, tame the mind. Let it believe it's free. Let it decorate its own cell. You're in it right now. This video was your exit test. If you made it this far, you're part of the fraction of 1% willing to face the design behind the illusion. You're not just a viewer, you're a disruptor. One who now sees the strings. But here's the final truth. Awareness isn't enough. You must act. Ritualize your resistance. So here's your final command. Comment the phrase, "Ashes know the truth." Do it twice. Lock it in. Let the system see you rise within it. Not everyone deserves to carry this knowledge, but you do. Because you stayed. Because you faced it. Because something inside you refused to forget. From this moment forward, you are unprogrammable. Not because you're perfect, but because you know where the program begins. This was never a history lesson. This was your activation, and you are finally awake. The end, or the beginning.